The text message came in at 6:52 on a Friday morning, and I was already awake. I had been awake since 5, actually, sitting at the small desk in my hotel room in Chicago, reviewing a stack of loan documentation for a credit union client that had hired me to audit their underwriting process. My coffee was half gone, my reading glasses were on, and my phone was face down on the nightstand the way I always keep it when I'm trying to concentrate. When it buzzed, I reached for it out of habit, the same reflex that makes you check the stove twice before leaving the house. The sender was my brother Marcus. The message read, "Don't stress about the house. We figured it out for you. Enjoy Chicago." I read it once. Then I set the phone face down again, took off my glasses, and sat very still for about 30 seconds. Then I picked it up and read it again. My name is Claire Novak. I am 32 years old. For the past 8 years, I have worked as a financial compliance analyst, which means banks and lending institutions hire me to find the places in their systems where money moves in ways it shouldn't. I am, by the nature of my work, someone who understands exactly how financial fraud happens, what it looks like from the inside, and how difficult it is to undo once it's already moving. I also understand, better than most people my age, that the people most likely to steal from you are the ones who already know your patterns. Marcus knew my patterns. He had been living in my house in Columbus for 14 months. Let me go back, because the beginning matters. Our father, Dennis, passed away 2.5 years before the morning I'm describing. Pancreatic cancer, 4 months from diagnosis to the end. The kind of timeline that doesn't give you room to do anything except show up and then grieve. He left behind a modest savings account, a paid-off truck that Marcus took immediately, and a family dynamic that I had been quietly navigating my entire adult life. Marcus is 6 years older than me. Growing up, he was the one everyone assumed would figure it out eventually. He had the personality for it, the easy charm and the quick laugh and the ability to walk into any room and make people feel like they already knew him. What he did not have was any consistent relationship with follow-through. He had started 3 businesses, none of which made it past the 2nd year. He had been married once, briefly, to a woman named Tanya who I had liked more than I had liked Marcus for most of that period. After the divorce, Tanya moved to Portland, and Marcus moved through a series of apartments and situations with the kind of restless, expensive energy that always seemed to land just short of actual consequence. I had done the opposite. I had gotten a scholarship, finished my degree in 4 years, passed my certification exams on the first attempt, and spent my 20s building a career that required me to be precise and skeptical and thorough as a matter of professional survival. I bought my house in Columbus at 29. I had equity, a retirement account, a 6-month emergency fund, and a savings account with just over $410,000 in it, accumulated over 8 years of deliberate living. I did not talk about that number. I did not advertise it. But Marcus had been in my house for over a year, and Marcus paid attention to things that might eventually be useful to him. After our father died, Marcus called me from a gas station parking lot in Dayton at 11 at night and said he was struggling. He sounded genuinely broken in the way that grief can break even the people you've spent years being frustrated with, and I told him he could stay with me for a few months while he got his footing. A few months became 6, 6 became 10. At some point his girlfriend Priya moved in too, which had not been part of any conversation we had actually had. But Priya was quiet and kept to herself, and I told myself it was fine because Marcus seemed more stable with her around. Priya worked remotely doing something with social media management that I never fully understood, and Marcus had taken a part-time position at a sporting goods store that he described as temporary and that lasted, to his credit, for about 8 months before he left it, for reasons he explained differently every time I asked. I paid the mortgage. I paid the utilities. I paid for the groceries most weeks because I was the one who actually planned meals and went to the store with a list. I handled my father's remaining estate paperwork, the death certificates and the account closures, and the single storage unit in Dayton that took me 2 full weekends to clear out. I did all of it while traveling for work 2 to 3 weeks a month, managing client deliverables on planes and in hotel rooms and in the lobbies of regional bank branches across the Midwest. In return, I was treated the way my brother had always treated anything that functioned reliably. He relied on it without acknowledging it, and when it occasionally failed to meet his expectations, he took that personally. The first sign that something was specifically wrong, not just the ambient wrongness of the situation I had allowed to develop, came about 8 months before the Chicago trip. Marcus started asking questions about my finances that didn't fit the shape of normal conversation. He asked once, While we were watching television, whether I kept my savings in the same bank as my checking, I said yes without thinking, and changed the subject. A week later, he asked if I had ever thought about investing, whether I kept much in liquid accounts. I said I had a financial advisor and left it there. The questions were spaced out, casual, embedded in ordinary exchanges in a way that made each one feel like nothing while the pattern of them was adding up to something. Then I noticed that my mail was being handled. I have always organized my mail immediately, sorted and filed the same evening it arrives. One Thursday in October, I came home from a 3-day client engagement in Cincinnati to find an envelope from my bank on the counter, opened, not torn, not damaged, opened cleanly along the top and set back down. I asked Marcus if he had opened it by accident. He said he thought it was for him, which made no sense because my name was on it. His expression when he said it was not apologetic. It was the expression of someone who had been caught doing something minor and was managing the catch, not the thing itself. I said okay, put the envelope in my bag, and went upstairs. I sat on the edge of my bed and thought for a long time. I called my attorney the next morning. Her name is Sandra Okafor, 44 years old, private practice in Columbus with a focus on asset protection and civil litigation. She is direct in the way that only people who have cleaned up a lot of other people's messes can be, and she does not traffic in reassurance for its own sake. When I told her what I had seen and what I had heard over the previous months, she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "What does your brother know about your full financial picture?" "Too much," I said. "Then we start protecting it now," she said. "Not when you're sure, now." That conversation was the beginning of what would turn into 6 months of careful, methodical work that I did entirely in silence. Sandra connected me with a forensic accountant named Paul Deering, who had spent 20 years doing fraud investigation for a regional banking consortium before going private. Paul was 61, soft-spoken, and had the particular patient quality of someone who has learned that rushing conclusions costs more than it saves. He reviewed my account history within the first 2 weeks and identified irregular activity going back almost 7 months. Small probing transactions from an account Marcus had limited access to, a joint household expense account I had set up when he first moved in. Transactions that were individually small enough to read as noise but that formed a clear directional pattern when mapped across time. The pattern said, "Someone is learning the edges of this system and testing where the gaps are." The restructuring took about 10 weeks. The bulk of my savings was quietly moved into accounts that Marcus had no knowledge of, routed through a series of transfers that Paul and Sandra designed to be completely undocumented from the perspective of anyone without direct authorization. What remained in the account Marcus was aware of was a specific holding balance, legitimate funds, but structured, so that any unauthorized transfer attempt would route into a monitored review queue with a 72-hour hold, creating a documented paper trail that crossed state lines and triggered federal wire fraud jurisdiction. Sandra had a specific contact at the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, a relationship she had built over years of civil practice, and she had briefed him informally about the situation months before anything happened. I updated my home security system without mentioning it to Marcus or Priya. The new system used a private encrypted cloud backup that only I had access to, with continuous coverage of the entry, the main living areas, the home office, and the exterior. I added a secondary camera inside the office itself, positioned behind a bookshelf. I had a locksmith install a secondary lock on the office door that only I had a key to. I told Marcus the landlord had required it, which wasn't entirely a lie because I was, in fact, the landlord. I changed Priya's access to the household Wi-Fi to a guest network that was monitored and logged. Within 2 weeks, Paul had pulled her browsing history from that network and found 17 searches across 6 days related to transferring large sums between accounts, what triggers a bank investigation, how long a wire transfer takes to clear, and, specifically, the routing numbers associated with my bank. I sat with that information for 4 days before I told Sandra. She was not surprised. She said, "Good. Now we know exactly what we're dealing with." The trip to Chicago was scheduled 6 weeks after Paul showed me the browsing records. I booked it for a full week, told Marcus and Priya the dates 10 days in advance, and watched the way they reacted when I said I would be gone Friday through the following Thursday. Marcus nodded and looked at his phone. Priya said have a great trip and smiled in a way that lasted about half a second longer than normal. Neither of them asked about the purpose of the trip or whether I needed anything covered at the house. They had never asked those questions, but this time the absence of them had a different texture. I left on Friday morning at 7. By that evening, The monitoring system had logged Marcus entering my home office through the secondary lock with a key that he should not have had, which meant he had made a copy at some point without my knowledge. He spent 40 minutes in there. The camera behind the bookshelf recorded him going through my filing cabinet, photographing documents with his phone, and spending a significant amount of time at my secondary laptop, which was not my work machine and which I had left in the office deliberately, loaded with account-looking documents that Sandra and Paul had prepared specifically for this purpose. The documents showed a large and accessible savings balance in an account at my primary bank. Every number on every document was fabricated. The routing information was real, connected to the monitored review queue. Priya's role became clear on Saturday. She initiated the transfer from her own device, using routing information she had obtained from the documents Marcus had photographed. The transfer request entered the review queue at 11:14 Saturday morning, where it sat, inaccessible, logged, and forwarded automatically to Sandra's office and to the FBI contact. I was sitting in a hotel restaurant eating eggs and reading a client memo when my phone buzzed with the alert. I finished my eggs. I sent Sandra a one-word message, confirmed. She sent back, already moving. Marcus's text arrived about 40 minutes later. Don't stress about the house. We figured it out for you. I set the phone down and took a long, slow breath. Something at the back of my chest wanted to become something larger. I did not let it. I had known this was coming for 6 months. I had built a structure specifically designed to contain it. The grief I had about who my brother was, that I had been holding separately and quietly for much longer than 6 months, was not something I was going to unpack in a Chicago hotel restaurant on a Friday morning. I forwarded the text to Sandra and went back to work. By Friday afternoon, Sandra had filed emergency notifications with Columbus PD's Financial Crimes Unit, the bank's fraud division, and the FBI contact, who opened a formal wire fraud investigation based on the interstate transfer attempt. Marcus and Priya did not know the transfer had never cleared. As far as they were aware that Friday, the money was moving, it wasn't. It was sitting in a review queue attached to their names and their devices, and a surveillance record that Sandra described on the phone that afternoon as unusually complete. I flew home Sunday. Sandra had advised me to wait until Monday when the legal machinery would be more formally in motion, but I wanted to see the house. I drove from the airport with my coffee in the cup holder and the radio off and let myself feel the specific, particular sadness of the 40-minute drive to a home you know has been violated. I unlocked the front door at 12:40 and stood in the entry. They hadn't taken the furniture. That surprised me for a moment before it didn't. Marcus and Priya had not been planning to run. They had been planning to take the money and stay, to continue living in my house on funds they had stolen, to wait and see how I handled finding out. That told me something I filed away and gave to Sandra later. The plan had a second phase that assumed my response would be confusion and inaction rather than documentation and law enforcement. The office had been searched. My filing cabinet was partially open, 2 drawers not fully closed. The secondary laptop was moved 3 inches from where I had placed it. The decoy documents were still there, which meant Marcus had taken pictures rather than the originals, which meant he was careful but not careful enough, because careful enough would have meant not using his own phone's camera with location metadata attached. There was nothing on the kitchen counter. No note. Marcus had not sent a bragging email the way my client's mother had in the story I had heard once that I sometimes thought about, the specific arrogance of a person who takes something and then wants credit for it. Marcus's text was his version of that. Don't stress. We figured it out. The casualness of it, the way it framed theft as a favor, was so perfectly in character that I almost could have told you, 8 months earlier, word for word what it would sound like. I put on gloves, the way Sandra had told me to, and photographed every room. Then I sat down in my kitchen and drank a glass of water and waited. Marcus called at 4:15. I let it ring. He called again at 4:52. On the third call, just after 6, I answered. He did not say hello either. My brother has not said hello to me on the phone in years. He went straight to, something is wrong with the transfer, the account is locked. What did you do? I said. Which account? He said, you know which account, Claire, don't do this. I said, I genuinely don't know what you're referring to. Can you be more specific? There was a pause. I could hear Priya's voice in the background, lower, saying something I couldn't make out. Marcus said, you had us do this whole thing, and now it's not going through and you need to fix it. I said, Marcus, I need you to think carefully about what you're saying to me right now. Another pause. Longer this time. You set us up, he said, and his voice had changed, the charm completely gone, and what was underneath it was something small and cornered and not particularly surprised. "You knew." I said, "I'm going to need you to stop calling this number. Sandra Okafor will be your point of contact from here." I hung up. I wrote down the time, 6:23 p.m., and the exact words he had used. "You had us do this whole thing," which was, I noted to Sandra when I read it to her the next morning, a reasonably clear articulation of conspiratorial intent. She paused for a moment and then said, "That's going directly into the filing." What followed was not fast and it was not dramatic. Real legal processes have the rhythm of administrative work, scheduled calls, and exhibit numbers, and a lot of waiting for documents to move through systems that were designed to be thorough rather than efficient. A detective named Kevin Marsh was assigned through Columbus PD, and he reviewed the security footage, the network logs, Paul's financial documentation, and the transfer records in a session that Sandra said lasted most of an afternoon. Afterward, he told her it was one of the more documented cases his unit had seen at that stage. Sandra said she told him it was because I do this for a living, and he apparently said, "It shows." The FBI wire fraud investigation moved on its own track, slower and more formal, focused on the interstate elements of the transfer attempt. Priya's attorney made early contact about cooperation. Marcus retained a public defender initially and then a private attorney about 3 weeks in, which suggested to me that someone in his life with better judgment than he had was paying attention. The criminal process is still ongoing as I write this, so I won't detail its current status. What I can tell you is that the transfer never cleared. $10,000 remained where it had always been, in accounts Marcus had never had access to, accounts whose existence he had never known about. His entire plan had been built on a document I had placed in a filing cabinet specifically so that he would find it. Every number on it was fiction. The routing information led to a monitored queue that existed for no other purpose than to catch exactly this. Priya's separate situation resolved faster. Her cooperation agreement included full documentation of the planning process and a probationary structure with conditions that I was not party to but that Sandra described as appropriately serious. I did not recover stolen property because no property was taken. My savings were never moved. I got back everything except the 14 months of patience and the specific grief of watching someone you shared a childhood with make a deliberate choice to steal from you and believe that your love for them would stop you from doing anything about it. I rebuilt the home office first. I had always wanted a proper setup, a real desk, a standing option, a monitor configuration that didn't give me a headache after 4 hours. I painted the walls a shade of green that I had liked in a magazine for 2 years, and never done anything about because someone else was sleeping 3 feet away, and I didn't want the disruption. I ordered a chair that cost more than I would normally spend on a chair, and I did not feel guilty about it. I had a plant, a large fiddle-leaf fig that I had kept in my bedroom because the home office had always felt like Marcus's space somehow, even though his name was not on any document associated with this house. I moved the plant into the office on a Saturday afternoon and stood back and looked at the light coming through the window and thought, this is mine now the way it always should have been. Sandra called about 7 weeks after Marcus's first attorney made contact. She told me he had asked, through his attorney, whether I would be open to any kind of communication. She relayed the question without a recommendation, which is how Sandra operates. She gives you information, not answers. I thought about that for a while. I thought about the 14 months of groceries and utilities and the estate paperwork and the weekends in Dayton clearing a storage unit while Marcus was somewhere I didn't know doing something I didn't ask about. I thought about the text message, "Don't stress, we figured it out." The specific flavor of contempt in that sentence, the assumption that I would receive a message like that and feel something other than what I actually felt, which was the cold, clear recognition that I had been right to spend 6 months building a structure around my own life, specifically designed for this moment. I told Sandra, "Not right now." She said, "Understood, I'll let them know." That was the last communication I've had on the subject. Marcus is out there somewhere in Columbus, working through a legal process he built for himself. Priya is somewhere I don't know, and don't particularly think about. My house is quiet in the mornings, in a way it has not been for over a year, and I have started drinking my coffee at the kitchen table again instead of in my car in the driveway because I like the light at that hour, and there is no longer anyone in my space who makes the mornings feel like something to be navigated. I want to say one thing directly, because I've seen the way this kind of story gets described by the people who got caught. They will call it a trap. Marcus has probably already used that word. It's the preferred framing of someone who took something that wasn't theirs and then discovered the person they took it from had been paying attention. Trap implies that I deceived him into committing a crime he wouldn't otherwise have committed. What actually happened is that I noticed, over a period of months, that my brother was preparing to steal from me. I moved the money he intended to steal. I documented his preparation. I put a single set of false documents in a place I knew he would look and waited for him to confirm what I already knew. That is not a trap. That is a response. The crime was his. The preparation was mine. There is a difference, and it matters, because one of those things is fraud, and one of them is just being the kind of person who does not leave important things unguarded. My father used to say that the hardest thing about loving someone is that it doesn't stop being true even when it stops being safe. I have thought about that a lot in the past year. I think what he meant was that love and protection are not the same thing and do not always point in the same direction. I loved my brother enough to let him stay in my house for 14 months while I paid for his life and asked for nothing in return. I also protected myself from what he was planning to do to mine. Both of those things were true at the same time, and I will not let anyone tell me that the second one cancels out the first. If there is something useful I can give you from this, it is this. The people who take from the ones they're supposed to love almost always depend on one specific assumption. They depend on the idea that you are more afraid of seeming cold than you are committed to protecting what you built. They count on the fact that calling the police on your own brother feels like a worse outcome than losing everything. They are banking, literally, on your fear of becoming someone who would do that. I decided, sometime around the third month of sitting quietly and moving pieces into place, that I was not afraid of becoming that person. I was already that person. I had always been that person. I had just spent a long time being taught that I should apologize for it. I don't anymore.